"Do you even know where you are, old man?" The words, sharp and laced with corrosive disdain, cut through the oppressive heat of the Paris Island training ground. Sergeant Eva Rostova, a drill instructor whose voice could strip paint from a battleship, stood with her hands on her hips, her frame a study in rigid intensity. Before her, seated on a simple wooden bench near the edge of the grueling obstacle course, was an old man. He looked to be in his 80s, with skin weathered like old leather and a calm that seemed utterly alien in this place of manufactured chaos. His name was Randall Morrison, and he just sat there, watching. Rostova's jaw was tight. This is a United States Marine Corps recruit depot, not a park bench for you to sit and watch the world go by. I asked you a question. Do you know where you are? She took a deliberate step closer, her polished boots crunching on the dusty gravel. The recruits, all of them young enough to be the old man's grandsons, had frozen mid-stride, their workout halted by the confrontation. They watched, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Randall Morrison's eyes, a pale faded blue, shifted slowly from the recruits to the sergeant. He didn't seem intimidated. He didn't seem angry. He just seemed present. "I know exactly where I am, Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but clear, a stark contrast to Rostova's parade ground bellow. The confrontation had been brewing for the better part of an hour. The old man had arrived without fanfare, parking a modest sedan in the visitor's lot and making his way to the edge of the training field. He hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't caused a disturbance. He simply sat on a bench under the thin shade of a pine tree and watched the young men and women of Platoon 3087 get put through their paces. At first, the drill instructors had ignored him, assuming he was a visiting family member who had perhaps wandered off from a tour group. But his stillness, his focused observation began to grate on Sergeant Rostova. He wasn't a tourist. Tourists looked at the buildings, took pictures, and moved on. This man looked at the recruits. He watched their form, their struggle, their grit. His gaze was too knowing, too analytical. It felt like a judgment. Finally, she had broken off from berating a recruit for a sloppy rifle hold and marched over to the old man. "Can I help you?" she had asked, the question a command. Randall had simply shaken his head. "Just watching," he'd replied. This was not the answer she was looking for. To her, his presence was a disruption, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of discipline and order she was tasked with maintaining. He was a variable she couldn't control. "And who gave you permission to be here?" she pressed, her voice rising in volume. The other drill instructors, a formidable pair of sergeants named Gunn and Chavez, began to drift closer, flanking her like two wolves sensing a challenge to the pack leader. The humid South Carolina air grew thick with tension. The rhythmic chants of other platoons in the distance seemed to fade away, leaving only the focused drama on this small patch of dirt. "I don't believe I need any," Randall said, his tone still even, still maddeningly calm. This was the final straw for Rostova. In her world, everything operated on a chain of command, on permissions asked for and granted. This old man's quiet defiance was a direct affront to that world. "That's it," she snapped. "I want your ID. Now, you're on a secure military installation, and you're interfering with training operations. Give me your identification, or I'll have the military police escort you out in handcuffs." The crowd of recruits watched, wide-eyed. This was more intense than any training exercise. The sight of their fearsome drill instructor facing off against a silent old man was surreal. They saw the injustice of it. The man had done nothing but sit quietly, yet he was being treated like a threat. Randall Morrison slowly reached into the pocket of his simple jacket, his movements deliberate, unhurried. The lack of fear, the absence of any sense of alarm, seemed to infuriate Rostova even more. She saw it as disrespect. She saw his age not as a signifier of a life lived, but as a weakness, a symbol of obsolescence that had no place in her world of peak physical conditioning and aggressive youth. As Randall fumbled in his pocket, the sleeve of his jacket rode up his forearm, revealing a tattoo. It was old, the lines blurred by decades of sun and stretching skin. The ink faded from a deep black to a hazy blue-gray. It depicted an eagle, its wings spread, clutching a bundle of arrows. It was a common enough patriotic symbol, and Rostova gave it only a passing, dismissive glance. It meant nothing to her, just another piece of faded bravado from a bygone era. She was focused on the ID, the tangible proof of identity that would allow her to categorize him, label him, and dismiss him. But her dismissal, her failure to truly see what was right in front of her, was the gravest mistake she would make all day. As Sergeant Rostova's dismissive gaze swept over the faded tattoo on Randall Morrison's arm, a flicker of an image, sharp and violent, cut through the quiet old man's mind. It wasn't a memory so much as a phantom sensation, an echo of a life lived at a different pitch. For a split second, the sun-baked training ground of Paris Island dissolved. The air, thick with humidity, was replaced by the suffocating, cloying smell of jungle rot and cordite. The dusty ground beneath his feet became slick, deep mud. He saw a hand, his hand, but young, strong, and covered in grime, gripping the worn stock of an M14 rifle. The same tattoo, the eagle with its arrows, was stark and black against his skin, a fresh mark of pride and defiance. The sound of Sergeant Rostova's voice was replaced by the deafening chatter of machine gun fire and the concussive whump of a mortar shell exploding somewhere too close. A young man's voice, hoarse with fear and adrenaline, screamed a name. Then, just as quickly as it came, the vision vanished. The oppressive quiet of the jungle was gone, and the rhythmic, aggressive shouts of the drill instructors returned. He was back on the bench, an old man under a pine tree, the sun warm on his face. The past was a ghost, but it was a ghost that never truly left him. Among the recruits of Platoon 3087, one young man stood frozen, his eyes locked on the old man's forearm. His name was Private Miller, a bookish kid from Ohio who had joined the Marines to prove something to himself and his family. Unlike Sergeant Rostova, Miller didn't just glance at the tattoo, he stared at it, his mind racing. He was a history buff, a young man who had spent countless hours watching documentaries and reading books about military history, particularly the stories of the Marine Corps. The eagle was generic, yes, but there was something else, a tiny detail almost lost in the faded ink. Below the eagle, nearly indistinguishable from the wrinkles on the old man's skin, was a small, stylized symbol, a skull superimposed over a 5-pointed star. Miller's blood ran cold. He had seen that symbol before. It wasn't in the official histories, not in the sanitized documentaries. It was in the footnotes of old books, on grainy black and white photographs in obscure online forums. It was the unofficial emblem of a unit that existed more in whispers and legends than in official records. A MAC-V-SOG unit, a special operations group that had conducted some of the most dangerous clandestine missions of the Vietnam War. They were ghosts, men who had operated deep behind enemy lines, men whose records were sealed and whose stories were never meant to be told. While Rostova, Gunn, and Chavez focused their combined pressure on Randall, escalating their demands for identification, Miller saw his chance. His heart pounded against his ribs. He felt a surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with the day's training. He knew he had to do something, but what? Directly confronting 3 drill instructors was professional suicide. He needed help. He needed someone who would understand. Thinking fast, he let his rifle slip from his grasp, clattering onto the gravel. Clumsy Miller. Sergeant Gunn bellowed instinctively, his attention momentarily diverted. "My apologies, Sergeant." Strap came loose. Miller called back, his voice cracking slightly. He knelt down, fumbling with the rifle sling, making a show of fixing it. It was the opening he needed. Keeping his head down, he shuffled backward, away from the confrontation, toward the barracks. No one stopped him. They were all too transfixed by the drama unfolding with the old man. Once he was out of their direct line of sight, Miller broke into a sprint. He ducked into a quiet corridor in the barracks, pulled out the contraband cell phone he kept hidden for emergencies, and dialed a number he knew by heart. His hands were shaking. The phone rang twice before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "John, what is it? You know you're not supposed to call me." "Grandpa, I know. I'm sorry, but you have to listen," Miller whispered, his words tumbling out in a rush. He quickly described the scene. The old man, the drill instructors, the confrontation. "A training dispute, John. That's not a reason to risk getting caught with a phone," his grandfather said, his tone impatient. "No, Grandpa, it's the old man," Miller insisted. "He has a tattoo, an eagle, but underneath it there's a skull and a star, a 5-pointed star." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The silence stretched for a full 10 seconds. When his grandfather spoke again, his voice was completely different. The impatience was gone, replaced by a tone of utter, deadly seriousness. "John," he said, his voice low and urgent, "describe the man to me." "Exactly." Miller described Randall, the faded blue eyes, the quiet dignity, the weathered face. As he spoke, he could hear the sound of a chair scraping and a rustle of papers on the other end of the line. "What's his name, John? Did you get his name?" I think I heard the sergeant call him Randall Morrison," Miller said. A sharp intake of breath, then another long silence. Finally, his grandfather spoke, and his voice was filled with a sense of awe and disbelief that chilled Miller to the bone. "Son, listen to me very carefully. Do not let them move him. Do not let them take him anywhere. I don't care what you have to do. Create a distraction. Feign a medical emergency. Do whatever it takes. Just keep him there. I'm making a call. Help is on the way. The line went dead. Private Miller stood alone in the empty corridor, the silence of the barracks a stark contrast to the storm that was about to break over Paris Island. He now understood that he had stumbled into something far bigger than a simple training ground dispute. He had become a witness to a legend. Miles away in a stately office at the heart of the Marine Corps base, Colonel Matthews was having a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. He was reviewing budget proposals, a tedious but necessary part of his command. His peaceful afternoon was shattered when his private line, the one reserved for general officers and extreme emergencies, buzzed to life. The caller ID showed a name that made him sit up straight. Retired Colonel John Miller Sr., a man who was not only a decorated officer but also a personal friend and mentor. He answered immediately. "Jack, what's going on?" He listened, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion, and then to stunned disbelief. He heard his friend relay the story from his grandson, the description of the old man, the name Randall Morrison, and the almost mythical tattoo. "Are you sure, Jack?" Colonel Matthews asked, his voice now a whisper. "The records say he died in '98. Jack's voice was firm on the other end. "The records were wrong. That's him. I'd bet my life on it." Colonel Matthews slammed the phone down. He barked an order to his aide. "Get me Sergeant Major Morrison's service record. The classified file. Now." The aide, a young captain, scurried away, bewildered by the sudden urgency. Within minutes, a thin, dust-covered folder marked with the highest security classifications was on the colonel's desk. Matthews opened it, and his breath caught in his throat. The black and white photo stapled to the inside cover showed a young man with old eyes, the same eyes Private Miller had described. And there, in stark official type, was the citation for the Medal of Honor, awarded in secret, for actions so heroic and so far outside the official rules of engagement that they had been buried for decades. The citation spoke of a lone Marine holding off 3 enemy platoons to allow his team to escape, a valor that bordered on the suicidal. "My God," Matthews breathed, slumping back in his chair. He looked out his window toward the distant training fields. Sergeant Major Randall Morrison, a living legend, a ghost of the Corps, was sitting on a bench on his base, and his drill instructors were treating him like a common trespasser. A wave of cold dread washed over the colonel. This was more than an embarrassment, it was a sacrilege. He shot to his feet. "Get me my vehicle, and get the base sergeant major. We're leaving right now," he roared. The entire headquarters building seemed to snap to attention, caught in the whirlwind of the colonel's sudden frantic energy. A storm was indeed coming to Paris Island. Back on the training ground, Sergeant Rostova's patience had completely evaporated. The old man had finally produced a wallet, but he was taking an eternity to pull out his ID, his gnarled fingers moving with painstaking slowness. To Rostova, it was the ultimate act of passive aggression. She saw his calm not as dignity, but as a calculated insult designed to undermine her authority in front of the recruits she was supposed to command. The heat, the pressure, and the old man's infuriating composure finally pushed her over the edge. "That's it. I'm done playing games," she declared, her voice cold and final. "You are being detained for trespassing on a federal installation and impeding military training. We'll sort this out down at the station." She reached out and grabbed Randall Morrison's arm to pull him to his feet. "You're going to come with me, and we're going to have a nice long chat. And then we'll get you a full medical and psychological evaluation. Clearly you're not all there." It was the ultimate insult, the final overreach. She had not only threatened his freedom but had questioned his sanity. It was a line from which there was no coming back. It was at that exact moment, as her fingers tightened on Randall's arm, that the sound of sirens, faint at first, began to grow rapidly louder. Every head, including Rostova's, turned toward the main road. A convoy of 3 black command vehicles was racing toward them, lights flashing, kicking up a plume of dust. They didn't slow down as they approached the training field but sped directly onto the hallowed parade ground, a place usually reserved for marching and ceremonies. They screeched to a halt just yards from the confrontation, the doors flying open before the vehicles had even fully stopped. Colonel Matthews, the base commander, erupted from the lead vehicle, his face a mask of thunderous fury. The base sergeant major, a man whose presence alone was enough to make most Marines tremble, was right behind him. They moved with a speed and purpose that signaled a crisis of the highest order. The sensory spectacle was overwhelming. The flashing lights, the slamming doors, the sight of the 2 highest-ranking men on the base striding across the field brought a dead silence to the entire area. Sergeant Rostova and her fellow drill instructors froze, their mouths agape, their minds struggling to process what was happening. The power dynamic of the entire situation had just been shattered in a matter of seconds. Colonel Matthews and the sergeant major didn't even glance at Sergeant Rostova. They walked past her as if she were a statue, their eyes fixed on one person and one person only, the quiet old man sitting on the bench. They stopped directly in front of Randall Morrison. For a moment, no one moved. Then, in a single, perfectly synchronized motion, the colonel and the sergeant major snapped to the sharpest, most profound salute of their careers. It was a salute of such deep, ingrained respect that it seemed to vibrate with a meaning that everyone present could feel, even if they didn't understand it. The colonel cleared his throat, but he did not break his salute. "Sergeant Major Randall Morrison," he said, his voice ringing out across the silent field, filled with an emotion that was part awe and part profound apology. "It is an honor, sir." The recruits gasped. The title Sergeant Major was one of the highest and most respected for an enlisted Marine. For a full colonel to address this quiet old man with such reverence was unthinkable. Then Colonel Matthews, still holding his salute, began to speak. He recited Randall Morrison's history as if reading from a sacred text. He spoke of his enlistment in 1965. He spoke of his service in Vietnam with a special operations unit whose name most had never heard, and then he told them why that name was spoken only in whispers. He described a night in the A Shau Valley, an ambush, and a young Sergeant Morrison who, after his entire team was wounded, single-handedly held off an enemy force of more than 200 soldiers for 6 straight hours, armed with little more than a rifle, a pistol, and a fierce will to protect his brothers. He spoke of acts of bravery that defied belief, acts that had earned him the Medal of Honor. As the colonel spoke, the story of Randall Morrison, the legend, unfolded before the eyes of the stunned onlookers. Rostova's face had gone completely white, her expression a shattered mosaic of shock, horror, and dawning comprehension. The tattoo she had dismissed as meaningless was the very symbol of the unit that had performed these impossible deeds. The quiet old man she had threatened and insulted was not just a veteran, he was a hero of the highest order, a piece of living history she had been desecrating. The crowd of recruits stared, their chests swelling with a pride and awe so intense it was almost painful. They were standing on the same ground as a giant. They were breathing the same air. After the colonel finished speaking, a heavy silence fell over the training ground. He finally lowered his salute, but his eyes remained fixed on Randall, full of respect. Then he turned his gaze to Sergeant Rostova. His voice when he spoke was not loud, but it was colder and sharper than any bayonet. "Sergeant," he began, "you stand on ground hallowed by the footsteps of men like this. Your job is to forge Marines, but you cannot forge them if you do not understand the metal they are made from. You saw an old man, and you showed contempt. You should have seen a Titan, and you should have shown him the respect he has earned 1,000 times over." Rostova stood rigid, her face pale, tears welling in her eyes. "Sir, I had no idea," she stammered. Before the colonel could respond, Randall Morrison slowly rose to his feet. He looked at the recruits, at the drill instructors, and finally at the humbled Sergeant Rostova. "The sergeant was doing her job," he said, his voice calm and forgiving. "Her job is to create disciplined Marines who are ready for anything. The world changes, the uniforms change, the weapons change, but the spirit inside the Marine does not. That is what matters." He looked directly at Rostova, and there was no anger in his eyes, only a gentle wisdom. "Discipline is vital, Sergeant, but compassion is what makes a leader." As Randall spoke those words, a final clear image bloomed in his memory. It was not of battle, but of brotherhood. He was a young man again, barely 20 years old, sitting in a makeshift tent deep in the jungles of Vietnam. The air was thick with the smell of canvas and sweat. A fellow Marine, a man with a steady hand and a homemade tattoo gun, was carefully inking the eagle skull and star onto his forearm. They were all getting one. It was a pact, a silent promise to one another that they would never be forgotten, that what they were doing in that secret, brutal war would mean something, even if no one else ever knew. The tattoo was not a symbol of war. It was a symbol of the love they had for the men to their left and their right. It was a mark of family, born in the crucible of conflict. The fallout from that day was swift and decisive. Sergeant Eva Rostova was not discharged, a testament to Randall Morrison's plea for understanding. However, she was immediately reassigned from her role as a drill instructor. Colonel Matthews, in a move that sent ripples throughout the training command, tasked her with developing and personally leading a new mandatory course for all instructors on the history of the Corps, with a special emphasis on veteran recognition and oral histories. It was a penance, but also an opportunity for her to truly learn the lesson Randall had offered. A formal ceremony was held a week later, where the entire base honored the quiet hero who had walked among them unnoticed. Several weeks after the incident, Eva Rostova, dressed in civilian clothes, walked into a small coffee shop in the nearby town of Beaufort. She saw Randall Morrison sitting at a small table by the window, sipping a cup of black coffee and reading a newspaper. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to his table. He looked up and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. For a moment she just stood there, unable to speak. Then the words came. "Sir," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to apologize. In person. What I did, there's no excuse for it. I was wrong, and I am truly deeply sorry." Randall looked at her for a long moment, then gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, Sergeant," he said gently. She sat. He folded his newspaper and looked at her, his pale blue eyes clear and direct. "You have learned," he said. "That is all that matters. Now tell me, how are the new recruits in Platoon 3087 coming along?" It was an act of complete forgiveness, a simple, graceful gesture that closed the book on her shame and offered her a path forward. They sat there for an hour, a young Marine and an old one, talking not as antagonists, but as members of the same enduring family. If you were moved by the story of Sergeant Major Randall Morrison and believe that our heroes deserve to be remembered and respected, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Veteran Valor Stories for more tales of unassuming heroes.